Hello, my name is Sigrid Stagl. I'm a professor for environmental economics at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And today I'm going to talk about ecological economics, which is my field of expertise, which is an interdisciplinary field of analysis to which people from different disciplines are contributing. Myself, I'm a trained economist. But I very much appreciate the openness of this interdisciplinary field. I'll start with talking about some basic principles, because depending on which basic principles one thinks about an economy, how the economy is being organized, very different results will arise. Most economists think about the basic principle of efficiency as the main organizing principle. Obviously, it makes sense to aim for an efficient economy because not being efficient would be accepting wastefulness. So, of course, we want to be efficient, but is it the only principle? And I would argue no. We also need equity. This is not new. Post-Keynesian economists have argued for a very long time that it's not enough to aim for efficiency and then after the fact correct via measures of social policy if unfair, inequitable situations arise or situations with high social inequality. It's not enough to correct after the fact, but instead we need to account for the distribution of income and wealth from the start, alongside the basic principle of efficiency. Then ecological economists came along about 25-30 years ago and argued that's still not enough. We also need to account for the biophysical boundaries. It's not enough to account for resource efficiency, energy efficiency, because as we will see later, when having higher resource efficiency, but a larger quantity being produced, it may still result in a larger overall amount of resources being used. Okay? So it's important to account for the overall biophysical impact and to acknowledge the insights from natural scientists who are talking about biophysical boundaries and to incorporate that into our economic analysis. And ecological economists have also, for a long time, been talking about the need for resilience of the economic system. But I think that's something that we are seeing at the moment with the COVID-19 crisis, that this is another dimension, another basic principle that an economy really needs to adhere to. I'll come back to this later. Within the last few months, which were highly unusual, we have seen that in the across over the globe, large decreases in global CO2 emissions were observable. Of course, that came along with a very high cost in the sense of shutting down whole economies, shutting down whole sectors across world regions in order to protect human health. Here we see the global emissions from the Global Carbon Project webpage from the 6th of April. A few days later, a few weeks later, the global CO2 decrease was only -6%. So the economies were rebounding as they were opened up again slowly. So we saw an extreme fall in CO2 emissions from COVID-19 confinements, but they came at a high cost and will not slow climate change. But what matters is what we do now. Yeah? And this is what politicians in Brussels are currently negotiating. A lot of measures were implemented on the nation state level already. And the question is, are these targeting sectors, are these targeting transition effort by use of public budgets. I think they should, absolutely. So when we're looking at economics and how successful the profession is, how successful economic thinking is in order to address the grand societal challenges, and I would say that, the climate crisis is a massive societal challenge, and at the moment, of course, the COVID-19 crisis. Neoclassical economics, which is definitely the mainstream, is based on Newtonian physics. This means that it's a very mechanistic way of thinking. It came along as economists try to be more scientific than other social sciences, so they try to base their thinking on Newtonian physics. And in the last few decades, we have realized that this attempt to be more scientific than the other social sciences came at a high price, namely that complexity went missing. Yeah. Fortunately, there are different schools of thought, and not all of them forgot about complexity. But in neoclassical economics, there's not really a notion of uncertainty, but rather future situations, future states, which cannot be predicted, but only be assessed or interpreted as risk. Which is, of course, a category mistake, because there's a difference between uncertainty and risk. For risk, we know the potential outcomes, but we also know the probability distribution of these potential outcomes. For uncertainty, we know the potential outcomes, but we do not know the probability distribution of these outcomes. So we need to distinguish between them. Because Keynesian economics, for example, but also evolutionary economics, are much more upfront in acknowledging uncertainty than neoclassical economics is. I mentioned already, efficiency is, of course, an important principle of economic analysis, but it's not a panacea. And unfortunately, this is how neoclassical economics sees it. Fairness, justice, social inequality, addressing social inequality is seen as a secondary goal. It's something after the fact that is being addressed later on. But as post-Keynesian economists have argued very effectively, is that these two goals need to be addressed at the same time. Otherwise, the structures, the institutions are geared towards one principle, namely efficiency, and leads to outcomes that are very difficult to correct after the fact. Okay. Also, there's the macroeconomic creed of economic growth as a response to socio-ecological concerns. And yeah, you've heard already from colleagues in this session about the early attempts of addressing limits to growth, and we're still struggling with that same rhetoric. Limits to growth 1972 was the first model that comprehensively, systematically, and globally addressed the challenge of economic growth on a finite planet. Since then, we have seen a lot of discussions about it, but mostly staying within this modernistic perspective of, we can have something like the belief that we can have something like qualitative growth. That's the rhetoric of the 1980s and 90s. Well, as long as every unit of income is produced with less resource input, with fewer emissions, we are on the right path. But from systematic analysis, we know that that's not necessarily the case, because it depends on how much quantity are we producing, how much GDP is the output. Later on, a decade later, it was called sustainable growth. And in the last 10, 15 years, it was called green growth. It's just changing in the names. The concept, the ideas are the same. It's modernistic. Through technological change, we're going to reduce the carbon intensity, material intensity of every unit of gross domestic product, but we're not questioning the goal of economic growth, and that is problematic. My position is I would much rather have observe a situation where we can actually achieve the goals that are laid out at the beginning, namely to have equity, staying within biophysical boundaries and resilience, with economic growth, because many social institutions such as pension systems, labor markets, even our education system are geared towards economic growth. So it would be easier if we could achieve these goals with economic growth, but from the macroeconomic analysis that I know, this seems very, very, very difficult. We need excellent new technologies. We need institutional change, social institutions, not just social innovations, not just technological innovations, in order to make that possible. So I think we need to prepare ourselves that economic growth cannot be the goal for all economies. It probably needs to remain a goal for poor countries, for poor regions, for poor households. But I don't think we can afford economic growth for rich countries, for rich regions, for rich households anymore as a general goal. Further on with what's wrong with economics, the social and environmental concerns are conceptualized as externalities. It's something like a system's failure. It's something that is not addressed. However, ecological economists have called it as cost shifting is a key feature of the economic system. Every economist learns in Economics 101 that externalities need to be addressed. Otherwise, economic actors are making wrong decisions systematically. So why we don't have a global carbon tax yet, why we don't at least have on a European level, on an American level, carbon taxes that are addressing these externalities that we have known about for decades, yet is not that this is an externality outside of the economic system, but rather the logic is very much within the economic system, namely that there is lobbying power. Yet, and this is the final point here, that power is only interpreted as market power, meaning the concentration of economic actors in how far they have an influence on the market price. Yet there is another element of power, more from political science understanding, that shapes the economic institutions or keeps them from changing, like with the externalities. So we have still institutions in our markets which do not require the economic actors to internalize, to account for all of the economic cost, but merely the private cost. Hence, we have a bias in the economic decision making. And here the one point that I didn't mention yet is the market fundamentalism, which is goes back to Karl Polanyi, who was an Austro-Hungarian institutional economist, economic historian, economic sociologist, anthropologist, so very much an interdisciplinary scholar. And he talked about the problem of the market starting to dominate our society. I'll come back. So if you go back briefly in the history of economic thought, obviously starting out with classical economics, where the natural environment was perceived as land, and it was a central concern. Land was the source for productivity. With neoclassical economics, about 100 years later, economics forgot about the environment. It ignores the economy-environment interactions. With neoclassical economics came also the idea that labor was much more productive than land, which came hand in hand with the changes in society, with changes in technology. So this is not incorrect, But the problem was that the land, the environment, was basically thrown out of the production function altogether. So it's not that the production for the new production function in neoclassical economics shouldn't reflect this change, that labor became more productive or more the source of productivity. That's fine, but completely throwing out land as a factor of production, that was problematic. It took almost 100 years until the environmental economics came about and reintroduced the environment into economics. In a strange form. I mentioned already the externalities, but very much accounting for the environment as one variable that is brought into the economic model without consideration that the economic model might need to change, and very much in monetary form. So the environment is perceived as a monetary factor. Natural scientists, critical economists, and other researchers were not satisfied with environmental economics, and this is why in 1990 they came together and started this new field, ecological economics, which starts from the economy-environment interactions. The interdependence of the economy and the environment is central to the satisfaction of human needs and desires. And as I mentioned at the beginning, it's an interdisciplinary field of research where different disciplines are contributing to. And you might wonder why it's then called economics. Well, it goes back to the Greek word oikos, the housekeeping, but it's the housekeeping of humans as well as the housekeeping of other species, housekeeping of nature. And in ecological economics, we're trying to bring these two versions of housekeeping together. So this is why it's called economics. Just to mention briefly what's wrong with merely focusing on efficiency, and with the rebound effect, we can illustrate that. I'm referring here to a study that was conducted by Steve Sorrell for the UK Energy Research Centre. He was quantifying that the rebound effect, which is challenging. He also tried not only to quantify the direct but also indirect effects, and efficiency improvements that rarely occur on their own, but need to be motivated, fostered by measures and policies. Steve Sorrell undertook a systematic review of the evidence and found that rebound effects are significant and will limit the potential for decoupling energy consumption. The rebound effect has been known in economics for a very long time. Jevons wrote about it in The Coal Question, his book. It is wholly a confusion of ideas to suppose that economical use of fuel is equivalent to diminishing consumption. The very contrary is the truth. Every improvement of the engine, when effected, does but accelerate anew the consumption of coal. So that is basically the illustration. Rebound effect. In other words, what the rebound effect, and here it's illustrated, what he just said in this quote in a bit more detail. What the rebound effect is that through efficiency increases, for example, a better technology, every unit that is produced becomes cheaper. Hence, maybe new consumers want to purchase this now cheaper product. And or they may not have to use the same amount of budget, the same share of the budget for purchasing this particular product. The question is, what are they using the remainder, the difference in the budget for? If they're using the difference for maybe massages, then in biophysical terms, that's not so problematic. But if they're using it for taking extra flight, then the overall effect of the efficiency improvement may be. Just to illustrate that briefly again, we may have a more energy efficient vehicle that takes less energy. This is a somewhat dated representation. We still have combustion engines here and going to the gasoline station. But this more efficient technology allows lower running cost. So we can drive further or more often or in larger vehicles. Yeah? So probably using more energy. The lower petrol bills will also lead to saved budgets. And then the question is, what do we do with this saved budget? It may well be, if we go for the massages, then in biophysical terms, that's positive compared to driving a car. But it may well be that if the consumers choose to purchase flights instead of driving, this may have actually a negative consequence. So just reducing the environmental impact through efficiency increase is not realistic. And we have embodied energy in the car. This is a particularly stupid case of a rebound. Go into detail of it. We also see the rebound effect with producers, not just with consumers. And we have not just the direct rebound effects, but also indirect rebound effects, economy-wide rebound effects. An economy that is more productive, that is more efficient, is normally more productive, and a more productive economy will probably produce higher gross domestic product, meaning more units being produced, and actually the energy savings may be eaten up effect. So there are blind spots. The energy efficiency may be measured in a variety of ways for a variety of system boundaries. So rebound effects depend on how energy efficiency is defined. And the second blind spot is improvements in energy efficiency rarely occur in isolation. So rebound effects need to be small just because the share of economy in total cost. The direct rebound effect normally is around 30%. The improvement in energy reduction from better technology is not realized as we would expect it from a lab. But the behavioral response to this better technology sort of eats away 30% of that improvement. Yeah? So we cannot realize the whole improvement from the technological improvement. Okay. And then there's the economy-wide rebound effect, which may increase that. So it's an empirical question. It depends a little bit on the type of technology that we are studying, but the rebound effect is significant. That it needs to be accounted for. So when advising policymakers, we need to know about this and take it into account. We cannot expect the improvements in energy use reductions as a result of policies as we would expect them from technological studies, from engineering studies, because we need to account for the behavioral response to new technology. The basic idea of ecological economics is moving away from merely the efficiency. Of course, ecological economists also like efficient solutions, but that's not enough. In ecological economics, the economy is embedded in nature. It is perceived as being embedded in nature. And economic processes are always also natural processes. Economic processes ought to be studied also as natural processes. So we need to have not just financial accounting, we need to have the real economy that is accounted for, but also the biophysical throughput through the economy in terms of energy and matter needs to be accounted for. And on a planetary level, this is done, of course, by natural scientists with the concept of planetary boundaries, but I think you heard about it in another talk already. As ecological economists, we're reading these materials, we're reading these ideas and operationalizations and try to take them into account in our economic analysis. In our economic analysis, we really need to have these biophysical boundaries. For example, what is left in terms of carbon budget for Austria, for example, what has been used up already and what is left. And of course, as we know, a large share of the total carbon budget has been used up. Only very little is still available. The current Austrian government is aiming for decarbonization by 2040, so that's even more ambitious than this one here. But we need to really come down quickly now with our emissions. Here is from YASA and Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, a study that was published 3 years ago in Science, with the basic idea of this carbon law, of reducing the carbon emissions by 50% roughly every 10 years. And what's really nice about this is because that can be done on a global level, but it could be also done on a national level, on a sectoral level, on a regional level, a company level, a household level. But reducing by at least 50% every 10 years. This is definitely necessary, because otherwise, where we are staying with the green growth is here. The carbon intensity increases as we slide along the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have gross domestic product. Here, green growth is defined by Peter Victor from his great book Managing Without Growth, Lower by Design, Not Disaster. There was actually a revised version that came out last year. And he defines it as at least staying within the biophysical boundary of, well, the level of 1990. And we see here that there's a trade-off between carbon intensity. If we are moving along the x-axis further out from the origin, of course, then we can only have a lower level of gross domestic product. If we are producing less carbon intensely, then we can have a higher gross domestic product. Yeah? So I think that is useful to illustrate this relationship between carbon intensity and the quantity that is being produced and is measured in gross domestic product. What's not sufficient anymore is to go for green growth, because, well, that may stabilize the emissions at the 1990 level, but we need to go beyond that. We need to decarbonize, of course. But not even that definition of green growth was achieved by the US. Britain did it, actually, and they went below the Kyoto target that they had. Like Austria looks very much like the US here. Unfortunately, we still have stabilized compared to 1990, but that is enough. For ecological economics, it's not only that we are concerned about staying within biophysical boundaries. I mentioned at the beginning also the inequity is important to account for. And here we have, for example, a depiction of the change in US real weekly wages over a period of almost 40 years. And we see that the bottom 10% of wage earners in the US took home less in real wages in 2016 compared to 1979. Yeah. For the median, meaning 50% of wage earners, there was a slight increase. But for the top 10%, there was a significant increase. Yeah. So the overall cake is distributed very differently in 2016 compared to 1979, and that is a real concern. Productivity has increased significantly between 1948 and 2015. Consistently, it has increased by 241%, yet the hourly compensation only went up by 112%. So the cake is divided up. If we see the whole income like a piece, like a cake, the share that goes to capital has increased compared to the share that has gone. The ethical challenge in the full world is if we have, for example, here the top 1 share of total US income. And according to a study by Emmanuel Zeiss, that the share was 100 years ago roughly the same as now, but there was, during the golden age of capitalism, that share was significantly lower, where we saw significant wealth taxes and especially income taxes, very progressive income taxes. But that income distribution really changed again over the last few decades. And if we can only have a stagnant cake, so to say, income, national income, the distribution of that cake becomes ever more important to talk about. Here we have the global adult population and the share of the total wealth by wealth group. And there we see that the poorest, 70% of the adult population own 2.7% of the total wealth. While the top 0.7% of the global adult population own almost 50%, to be precise, 45.9% of the total wealth. So significant inequality. Wealth inequality is much higher than income inequality between the different quartiles here. And from a dynamic analysis, we can also see that the different groups across the world have benefited in different ways from globalization and income changes in the last few almost 40 years. The vertical axis shows the total real income total real income growth between 1980 and 2016 for each percentile, and the global distribution of income per adult. The bottom 10 percentile are excluded as their income levels are close to zero. The top 1% is divided into smaller groups, so as to better account for its share in total global growth captured. What we see here is that the very poorest were locked out of that growth. They didn't almost benefit at all from the growth. There was a rising income in the emerging economies, mainly China. They benefited from the changes in the last few decades. There was a squeezed bottom 90% of the US and Western Europe. They didn't benefit from the change. They didn't benefit from that change, and the booming global elite benefited greatly. So equity, fairness, and justice is an important principle that we need to take into account. For moving towards socio-ecological economics, meaning where we're accounting for the ethical challenge as well as the limits to biophysical growth, while not forgetting, we need to rethink the basic values. We need to rethink what the goals are actually of economic production. And I would argue that instead of economic growth, they should be well-being, freedom, non-alienation, solidarity, social relations. So there's a large list of basic values that we could aim for. And when thinking about well-being, for example, there are multidimensional categories, concepts, for example, from Amartya Sen, which are very productive to use as the basic thinking. There are subjective and objective approaches that I would encourage you to look into when you're interested in alternative thinking. Finally, what are markets? I want to mention briefly that economists very rarely talk about markets, actually, which is very strange. It may sound very strange, but economists take markets as given. Hence, there's no need to talk about markets as these quotes indicate. But I think we should talk about markets. And the question is, what is a market? Well, we can see a market as a place, a physical or a virtual place, where there is a reasonable expectation to find both buyers and sellers for the same product or service. This is what the markets might look like. But where do the markets come from? Yeah? they're mostly absent in history. They rose in importance with capitalism and historically developed new rules, norms, and practices that regulate social life. This is the point that is made by Reinhard Pirker in markets as forms of regulation of social life. Markets can also be seen as institutions that facilitate economic interaction among buyers and sellers. I think that is a very productive way of thinking about markets. Markets as sets of institutions, as sets of rules. And if we don't like the outcome of a market because it doesn't address the grand societal challenges, we need to change these social institutions. We need to change these rules. This is what markets might look like. And when comparing them, how we're operating within a bazaar, like on the left side, and how we're operating in an Austrian supermarket, the norms that are at work, they're very different. We might negotiate in a bazaar, we're definitely not negotiating in a supermarket. Everybody knows that. So it's obvious that markets are sets of institutions. But this is what how markets are normally conceptualized in economics textbooks as a place where supply meets demand, where there's an equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price. I think that is for understanding markets. There are limits to markets. Of course, we cannot organize everything by markets. For example, child labor, prostitution, blood diamonds, international arms, addictive drugs, and so on. We object against letting these elements of society being organized. I need to rush as my time is past. So what are markets? Sets of social institutions. Idea that I want to get across. I would like to encourage you to look into the great transformation of Karl Polanyi. He criticizes the idea that markets are self-regulating. He calls it a stark utopia that can never be realized. And his idea is that markets are regulations themselves, and of course markets need to be. Okay. So the question is not whether markets need to be regulated, but just how they can be regulated. Polanyi has also a very interesting notion of freedom, which is not the liberal notion of freedom, but it's freedom as social freedom, that the conditions that need to be produced collectively so that everybody can live life. Here are some videos as well as the recommendation of the book by Fred Block and Margaret Summer on the power of market fundamentalism. And socio-ecological economic insights are that the world is a full world. We need to account for that by having biophysical boundaries in our economic analysis. Greater size implies greater risk for life support systems, and I think we've seen that now with COVID-19. They're encroaching more and more into the world's ecosystems. That leads to a risk that we are taking. And this is why I think adding resilience as a system characteristics to the list of efficiency, equity, biophysical boundaries, and the resilience is really important. The need to integrate the social and environmental dimensions into economics and measurement is important for. Here's a way of trying to account for the biophysical boundaries as well as the social thresholds. This is a project that was undertaken by researchers at the University of Leeds, and here is a link to it. Basically, it shows, based on data that were available across different nations, it tries to show empirically how biophysical boundaries are addressed, are accounted for, respected in different countries, and to what extent social thresholds are met in different countries. The upshot is there is no perfect country, but you can go and look for your own country. This is the depiction of Austria, and yeah, go and country or others that you might be interested in. This is what we have been working on, a way of borrowing from Kate Raworth's donut economics, but trying to conceptualize the inner part, because that conceptualization is still missing, of course, taking the biophysical boundaries on the outside, but what's in the middle, and we played around with that a little bit. Well, it may be services like participation, mobility, but it may be also human flourishing, based on a much sense, capability approach, maybe well-being needs. All that could be conceptualizations of human flourishing. And I think accounting for the biophysical boundaries, but being more explicit about how human flourishing is conceptualized, and then using the space for different societies to organize themselves, might be a new way of thinking about socio-ecological economics. What we are trying to do here is develop an integrated perspective that goes way beyond the pillars or the layered perspectives, and reforming economic accounting to record the depletion of resources and pollution and track links within the economy, inform decision makers in economic institutions about the implications of their decisions, better account for risks, and of course have a notion of uncertainty, and question the role of economic growth in a sustainable economy. Thank you very much for paying attention. Sorry for running over in time.